I'm American, been based in Hong Kong now. I was born in Kansas. I grew up in Fiji and the Philippines and Micronesia, and then ended up back in the States in California, where I started my studies. I was one of those guys that took a really long time to get through the first 2 years of my undergrad, because I was having too much fun in Southern California. But luckily, one of the things that I started to do when I was screwing around in Southern California was I started taking night classes in furniture making. And so for a few years, I would work in the day as a dishwasher or a busboy, a waiter, a bartender, eventually a bar manager. And at night, I was taking night classes in furniture. And that kind of lame, slow process actually turned out to be really useful to what I do in my business today. The work that I did in those night classes at the community college allowed me to put together a little portfolio that was dignified enough that I was accepted to the Art Institute in Chicago, which is a pretty good school for interior architecture. And so I went to the Art Institute in Chicago, and then as an exchange student, I went to the Netherlands and studied at Rietveld Academie in Amsterdam. And I finished that, and I'm like, the last thing I want to do is go back to America, because the kind of design, for lots of reasons, but back then it was not the same reasons as today, though. Those are different reasons. But I knew that I didn't want to go back to the States because I didn't feel like the kind of design that Americans are practicing in general, even today, is not really where I wanted to be. It tends to be really specialized, and you end up kind of shoved into a niche, and you stay there, and that's where you're stuck. And what I love about the formation of designers in Europe is that it's much more broad. There's that whole kind of from the what was it, from the teaspoon to the city, where as a designer, you should be able to work with experts to develop just about anything. So I ended up moving to Milan and studied at Domus Academy in Milan, and got a gig working for a British designer named James Irvin, who's not so well known, but really talented. He's a contemporary of Jasper Morrison. He did a lot of work for B&B, for Cappellini, for Magis, and we designed the city buses for the city of Hanover in Germany. We did a lot of really interesting things, industrial design, furniture design. And so I spent 4 years learning a lot from him, and then I spent a year working for Ettore Sottsass, which was a super cool experience, because he's kind of a god of Italian design, and he was already very old, but in the office every day. And I gained a lot from my experience working there with him. So it's very much about marketing, and it needed to be super strong, and it needed to respect the history of the brand that Franco Moschino had created. The concept that I developed for this project was pretty simple, but it gave me some opportunities to play around. It was use architectural materials to make fashion, and use fashion materials to make architecture. So that central column, you can't see it in this slide just because of the projection, but it's 40 kilometers of stacked fabric. So at first glance, it's just a very minimal cube, but as you get closer to it, there's this beautiful texture to it. It's not wrapped, it's stacked, 1 millimeter, 1 millimeter, 1 millimeter, 1 millimeter. And so that became kind of the focal point of the space, and then everything kind of rotates around that. The chandeliers, I guess another theme to this project was that I wanted a lot of it to kind of sit in the background. It's become kind of a theme throughout my career. If you notice it, I'm really happy, but if you don't notice it, it still works. So these chandeliers, which look really classic, are actually blown glass high-heeled shoes. So another kind of Cinderella reference, which ties in with the irony and the kind of playfulness that Franco Moschino created for his brand. There was nothing left. They had no archives. They had no knowledge of what came before. They didn't have any of the old clothes even. All they had really was this cool logo. And so what I did is because I didn't have anything else to work with, I thought, okay, the great thing about this logo is this kind of syncopation. It's this curve and cut, curve and cut, curve and cut. And I thought that's an interesting thing to play with on a purely aesthetic level. So this space though, like getting back to the design. Can we just like stop talking about my president? So the space itself though was in a sense it was great because it was absolutely empty. It was just a big box. It was a concrete box with nothing in it. No columns, no pillars, no walls, no nothing. And so the first thing I thought of was, again, with this idea of playing with the logo as an inspiration for the design. One of my all-time favorite designers, engineer, architect, whatever, is a guy named Pierluigi Nervi, who's the guy who created the Olympic Stadium, the covered stadium in Rome for the Olympics in like '62 or something. And he was the great master of shaped concrete to do these incredibly elegant forms. And so this became kind of an homage to him. Fortunes of my career is that I've found ways to be able to control, to design the lamps, to design the tables, to design the chairs, to design the garment rails, whatever, and which helps kind of reinforce that entire concept. So anyway, the chef calls, and the message I get is that he wants to talk about a chair. And I'm like, all right, great. So I call the guy back, and it turns out that he's super cool, and he's really talented, and he's worked for some of the best chefs in the world. And he just happens to be opening up a new restaurant right around the corner from my office. And so we ended up meeting and hitting it off immediately. And so I did his first restaurant, his first Yardbird, and it became this massive success. And then all of a sudden, I'm not doing luxury retail anymore. I've become like the guy to go to. Can you do something sort of like Yardbird, but it looks different, but kind of the same? It's in an old go-down. It's a massive old warehouse in the dried fish market area of Hong Kong. So it's kind of a little bit hip, a little bit off the beaten path, 6,000 square feet. And this project was very much about, well, first of all, obviously reinforcing his concept, but also a lot about stripping away the design. So 18 years later, I'm like, I don't really like design that much. I think the more design sits in the background and helps kind of reinforce the experience that you're having, the better it is. So with this project, the palette's super stripped down. It's oak, it's black, it's some really nice Japanese tiles, and it's a lot of attention to lighting and acoustics. And that's about it. Because I realized that the more you're thinking about the food and the service and how much fun you're having and how cool you feel when you're in this place, the better. And the less you're talking about the design, definitely the better. So a lot of this stuff, I mean, it's all cool and it's super dignified design, but it's in the background. And that's where I kind of like to be these days. So this is the front room. Everything is high seating and standing, and you're seeing it on in a moment when it's closed, so you can actually see some of the stuff, because every single night this place is packed. As an old friend of mine says, it's nuts to butts, just packed. So there's this central this first room, which is the bar, which tilts more towards drinking, but also has food. I did things like the old Paris zinc bars. This one I used instead a thick sheet aluminum with no finish on it. We polished it but left it raw. So the more you use it, the more it gets scratched up, the nicer it is. You know, it's got some kind of history in it. Then you go back into the back room, and there's this big open kitchen, which I created as a all-black kitchen to create, and quite nicely lit, which creates this kind of scenographic thing for the 20-odd chefs that are running like crazy trying to prepare the food in this place. Down one side, because like most designers, I'm sort of neurotic. I sort of like to sit with my back to the wall or sort of up against something, you know. So I created this line of booths, and instinctively, I was right. Everybody else is a little bit neurotic too. They love, this is like the most popular strip of seating in the restaurant. And then because, okay, so the chef is actually, he's a young kid from Calgary, from Canada. like I said, I'm a guy from Kansas City, and this is a Japanese restaurant. So the world has gotten really weird and small, but in cool ways. But it's more than anything, it's a Hong Kong restaurant. And one of the things that he really wanted to emphasize was that these roots in Hong Kong. So we did all of the signage. So these are the press plates for the restrooms. Those are the men's and women's restrooms. So they're in Chinese and English. As you enter into the restaurant, this has the traditional Cantonese greeting, which is not hello, but have you eaten yet? Which is kind of nice. And then on the back side of that, as you're leaving, you see the traditional thank you in Cantonese, ngoi sai. But it's one of those things that mostly people don't ever see. It's there if you notice it, but if you don't notice it, that's cool too. And then these are this is some of the furniture that I designed for that project that then evolved into products that I sell around the world. The Yardbird chair with cushion or without, or bar stool, whatever. A couple of different tables. And it's called Rencon, which means lotus root. And this is another story where this one's in Ho Chi Minh City, so Saigon. The clients are young, cool Canadian guys, because it seems like in Asia, if you're cool, you're probably Canadian, which is sort of irritating for us. Us Americans, but whatever. They've got Justin, we've got Donald. This project I took as an opportunity to play with really interesting materials and techniques that you can only do in Vietnam, because they would be too expensive to do anywhere else. So we did stuff like, I did custom breeze blocks. I mean, where in the world could you possibly do custom breeze blocks? So they're doubled up, so they create that kind of nice repeating pattern that separates us from a bombed out ghetto behind. So I didn't want anybody to see that view anyway. And they sort of reference what a rencon, what a lotus root looks like when you slice through it sectionally. So, and another big influence for me has always been brutalist architecture. And so this kind of rough concrete stuff. So that became kind of a theme through this project as well. I'll gesture. You can tell I spent 15 years in Italy. So these are techniques that you just can't do anymore in most of the world. It's too expensive. It used to be something really poor. It was like, if you were a really poor person in a crappy apartment building, it had terrazzo. Now it's become kind of a luxury thing. So the columns are done with terrazzo. We did these custom breeze block. Even the tables, you can see, they're custom made, custom cast in terrazzo. And then, so it's two levels. There's a ground floor, which is, again, like Yardbird. The front area is more tilted towards bar. The upstairs is more tilted towards dining. There's the big central staircase. And then towards the back, you start to ease into this. I felt like everything felt a little bit severe, and it needed something a little bit ironic. And thinking about the fact that, again, it's a situation with Canadian guys and a guy from Kansas City opening a Japanese restaurant, this time in Vietnam, we needed something that kind of pulled together those cultures. And I found this really cool Japanese-American artist that did these really beautiful but really funny images of geishas with ice cream cones. So we contacted him and got the rights, and he allowed us to reproduce. And this was all painted by hand. This is it's all repainted. So he allowed us to replicate this early work of his from the 70s. It's called something like 31 Flavors Invade Japan. For the dining room, you can see I did these custom chairs for that project that are now a new product called chopsticks. They look a bit like chopsticks. And because we did so much structural work here, I had the opportunity to actually lower the open kitchen down so that the chefs are at eye level with you sitting at dining height, which is something that you can almost never do. It was something that I've always wanted to do. This was finally the opportunity. And because the upstairs floor is raised, it allowed me to hide all of the M&E work underneath this floor instead of below the ceiling of the ground floor. So it allowed me to keep the ceiling height really, really high on the ground floor. And that's the chair. We've got a sample over here in black. I quite like it. It looks almost like a Chinese character. And there's something quite nice of the dynamic of the way the legs interlock. And then this is the bar stool that we used for that, which is one of my favorites just because it's such a minimal object. It's 3 discs in a tube. continuing the 3 discs and a tube, because I ended up using it for this project as well. This is a project in Bangkok called Jua. And Jua means hit me, like give me another card. This was an illegal gambling den on the outskirts of Bangkok in what is now the Arts District. I'm like, okay, we're going to take the terrazzo and we're going to do everything in terrazzo. So from the wainscot, the bar top, the bar front, flowing into the floor, flowing into the stairs, flowing around the corner, it's a mono material. The whole thing is just one material. And what I really like about this project, I mean, it's super modest, but it sits in the background. It's all about the experience, and it looks like it's always been this way. It looks like they found this old bar from the 1950s in Bangkok, and they put some new bar stools in it and opened. And I really like that kind of quiet design in the background. So everything I said about minimalism, you can. I mean, in the end, what you're trying to do is you're trying to reinforce what your client needs to communicate. I mean, that's that, and I'm cool with that. I really enjoy that process. Okay, so these guys come to me. He's from Punjab, which is that region of Pakistan and India where they hate everyone else from Pakistan or India. Like Punjab is Punjab. And he brought in one of the greatest Indian chefs, actually Pakistani chefs from London to run this restaurant in Hong Kong. And he wanted it to feel like it was an old colonial place in Pakistan. So I did things like the classic button-tufted booths. This is the whole restaurant, by the way. It's really, really small. There's not much to it. But those button-tufted booths are horsehair and spring. So it's like sitting in a 1950s Cadillac. It's like the sexiest seat ever. So it's even the seating has a really old-fashioned feel to it. I found these cane chairs, made these fake custom colonial style dining tables in the center and whatnot. The lamps, I had found this cool little lamp in Denmark years before, this tiny little thing that I thought was nice, and it sat on a shelf, and I realized that if I blew it up to a much bigger scale, it would be a really nice addition to this project. So it evolved into that. The other thing that I did that is probably my favorite part of the project is that these textured walls, they're machined out of concrete slabs. And in Punjab, kind of the most famous thing about Punjab are their trucks. They're truckers. These guys have the most amazing trucks you've ever seen in your life. I'm sure they love them more than their children. They're intensely decorated. If you've ever been to the Philippines and seen the jeepneys that drive around the Philippines, or some of the like stuff in Bangkok even, but they're really encrusted with layers of colors and textures and materials and stuff. And I wanted to play around with that in a more subtle way. So I started researching the patterns that they often use and came up with, we created this pattern, which is based on the Punjab truck patterns, and then had it machined into these concrete panels. Okay, while I'm not a big fan of Instagram, I understand that if you can provide your clients with a really good Instagram moment, it pays off in spades. So this place is Cantonese food. The chef is Jawat Yu, who used to work for, what's it called, Mr. Wong, and the Chinese restaurant in Australia that has the best name of all Chinese restaurants. It's called Ms. G, MSG. Super cool. So they hired away this chef, and they wanted me to create this kind of playful Cantonese restaurant experience. And so, and I've worked with these guys before, and they always give me like the worst possible spaces. This used to be a really dank gay bar in Hong Kong. Super low ceilings. It's all in the basement. There's this ground floor, which is kind of decent, and then the basement, which is completely hopeless. It's the ceilings are like 2 meters. I'm exaggerating, but more or less, like barely more than that. And so the big problem here was, this is a pretty good ground floor space. We can put some seating here. We could put some dining up here. It's much more than we need for the kitchen. The logic would be to put dining up here, put the kitchen down in the back, and put some more dining downstairs. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought that if there's dining upstairs, anybody who goes downstairs is going to feel cheated. They're going to be like, oh, we got stuck in the basement. So instead, I created this really open, really loud Cantonese kitchen with geese, roasted geese, and woks with flames blowing up, a meter. It's really energetic here. And then this angled facade leads you down into the basement where the dining room is. So the whole facade is clad with real mahjong tiles. And then as you go into the space, as you can already see from this image, there's an entire wall of lucky cats all waving, and they're not synchronized, so they're like, So it's pretty fun and playful, and it's definitely an Instagram moment. So a friend of mine, another chef, he sent me an image from Instagram that he had seen of a woman and her friend kind of in front of this. And I'm like, oh, that's cool. I said, who is it? And he said, Sasha Grey. I'm like, who's Sasha Grey? I don't know if you know Sasha Grey. She's a porn star in America. So I'm like, all right, I've made it up. There's a porn star like waving in front of the cat. So anyway, you go down into the space, and I'm trying to pull together all these references to old school Hong Kong that I love. It's a decade that I've lived there. It's home. And there's a lot of really cool things to play with. So there's this great big dragon on the back wall. That's the focal point as you come down into this low ceiling dining room. Because the whole strategy is to distract you from that low ceiling. So I left all the walls raw concrete and did this illuminated dragon, which is made out of thick cut perspex. What you see as black is actually mirror, and what you see as yellow is the light box quite far behind it. So it's a quite three-dimensional thing. All the tables and the chairs are cut down so that when you're sitting there, the ceiling feels a little bit higher than it actually is. The other thing about this project is that there's 4 restaurants in the building, same landlord, but 4 different tenants. And all of their M&E works ducts through my restaurant. So all of that stuff on the ceiling, almost all of it, isn't even ours, but there's nothing I can do about it, and I can't hide it. So again, the strategy is, how do you distract from all that crap on the ceiling? We found this really cool young Hong Kong artist that does street scenes. So I had him do a series of Hong Kong street scenes mounted on light boxes. So there's all this light at eye level, all to distract you from what's going on up above. And then this is the dividing wall between the steps leading down into the basement. This is a Hong Kong graffiti artist, an elderly guy, passed away recently, named the King of Kowloon. And the King of Kowloon would walk around the streets of Hong Kong and paint entire walls with these random characters in Chinese. And a lot of my team is local, and I'm like, can you translate that? And they're like, no, impossible. It's basically just random babble, but it looks really cool. So this is my love letter to the King of Kowloon. And then this is the chair that I used for that project. And there's if we had another few hours, I'd tell you stories about this one, because this one originally was designed for the granddaughter of Chairman Mao. So now you can hate me even more. You're 3 degrees of separation, not just from Trump, but from Mao. I did a whole big project for her that everybody was happy with, and then it got canceled and never went anywhere. But I had this kind of cool chair that was sitting there ready to use for something. A little bit contemporary, a little bit Asian feeling, a little bit like a Ming Dynasty hat chair. This is for the Hong Kong Cricket Club, because they sensed that as a guy from Kansas City, I would have a deep understanding of cricket. They asked me to come in and redo their pub, because I would have a deep understanding of pubs too, right? So this was an interesting job, because I had about 4,000 clients, and they all had different ideas about what they wanted. This one is for a chef from New Orleans that moved to Japan and worked on rice farms, worked in sake producers, he's a really passionate about Japanese food. On the ground floor, he's got this kind of punk rock izakaya, really loud music, really good food, very rough. And then upstairs, he has this omakase, where on the weekends he does very expensive, very, very precise sushi. And here his brief was, I wanted to feel like an old school Hong Kong butcher, which is kind of brave, I think. So, like all the old Hong Kong butchers, we tiled everything. I found these really cool tiles from Holland that have a really nice curve to them. But it's basically an entire kind of stripped down minimalist omakase sushi bar where all of the focus is on him and the food. I think we've got time for one more before the end. This one is a restaurant I did for a Vietnamese American chef that specializes in street food. So it's his reinterpretations of Vietnamese street food called Viet Kitchen. And as you come in, I wanted to reference all of the things that you would find on the street in Vietnam. So there's the sliding gate, but this one is made in very nicely polished, thick stainless steel, and it doesn't slide. It's just the backdrop for the reception. You can just barely see the pattern on the floor. That's the sidewalk pattern that you see everywhere in Vietnam. So I had those custom machined out of a marble tile. The stools and the chairs are basically inspired by those cheap little, very low plastic stools that you find everywhere in Vietnam. But these are welded and polished, laser-cut stainless powder-coated steel. And then across the back wall, it's an entire wall of very colorful Tet masks from central Vietnam. And you can see the ceiling. The ceiling is corrugated sheet metal. Just sort of apparently random layers of corrugated sheet metal. Each one has been bonded with the industrial felt for acoustics. But what that allowed me to do too was it allowed me to have really simple access to all the M&E work above. So it allowed me to eliminate all the access panels and stuff that you would normally find. Most of these projects that you see took 3 months from the first phone call to an open restaurant. Okay? And most of them had a complete crap budget. So I'm working with pennies on the dollar and with a small team that's sprinting. The good news about that is it means that I think at least every designer I know distracts easily. If you've got a 3-month project, you can stay focused until it's done and then move on to the next. I mean, so the challenge, I guess, for me is dealing with budget and time. It's because these are really sprinting every single time. But it also makes it super fun. And it means that my body of work is a lot bigger than most people just because I do all these really fast projects. You know, where I think, you know, most of us end up with much longer project times. You know, we have to sprint, so I get more stuff in my portfolio. Maybe the biggest part of the fast pace is just the fact that we're in Hong Kong, because the cost of living, the cost of rent is just insane. Basically, they've got 1 month of free rent if they're lucky, and if they're at best, they've got a 3-year lease. So if they don't amortize everything and makes within 3 years, because who knows what that landlord's going to do after 3 years. In fact, the original Yardbird, which I didn't show, but anyway, it's basically a smaller, less refined version of that first project that I showed. That original Yardbird, the landlord quadrupled their rent when the lease was up. And it was like 1,500 square feet. And they quadrupled the rent, and they were also taking a percentage of the till, because that's the other thing they do in Hong Kong. So they don't just take the rent, they take a percentage of your sales. So you have to sprint to make money because you don't know what's going to happen in 3 years. I mean, luckily, most of what I do, with I think one exception or maybe two, everything I've done is still doing really, really well. Part of the way I make money actually is this trick I have of designing the furniture for the projects, because at least then that is an income stream that you know it's never a huge amount of money, and the furniture I design is also not terribly expensive. So it's not like I'm making huge royalties on these things. It's a nickel here, a nickel there, but it's consistent and it grows, and it's something that kind of helps stabilize the rest of the business, because the interiors are unpredictable as hell. You never know what's going to come in or if it's going to come in. So he asked me to go back and develop a much smaller footprint chair where he could squeeze in more seats, because in whatever it was, 1,500 square feet, there's not much you can do. We actually did a smaller version of the Copine, but it's not as nice. So I think it might still be floating around somewhere. It might still be in the catalog, but I don't think so, because everybody buys the normal one, because the normal one's the nice one. And that, so in the end, we ended up I created the Yardbird for that. First of all, I'm an interior architect and a furniture designer. Actually, an industrial designer, if you want to be really precise. But I haven't done much industrial design for a long time. It's kind of drifted over to mostly furniture. But I guess for me, interiors are like an epic poem, and furniture is like a haiku. So, I mean, yes, I have said that before, I confess. I didn't just pull that out of my... But there is a lot of truth in that. I think, the complexity of doing these interior architecture projects where we're pulling together so many different pieces, and to be frank too, we're not even talking about the most important stuff, which is, how do you create that vibe? How do you deal with the acoustics? How do you deal with the illumination? How do you deal with the flow? How do you make it work? Okay, which is all the stuff that we haven't talked about tonight at all, which is actually the funnest part for me. Mostly what we've talked about is the stuff that I tack on after we've done all that more important stuff, I think. There's all those pieces that fit together, and that makes the interior architecture projects fun. But there's nothing nicer for me than to kind of sit down and very calmly and methodically and obsessively and neurotically screw around with stupid little details that nobody's going to notice on a chair leg. And those projects are fun because there is no timeline. I mean, of course there is if I'm trying to squeeze it into an interiors project, but otherwise there's no timeline. I can, if it's not right, I can stick it in a drawer and forget it for a while, which is something that I tell my team to do all the time. I'm like, this is totally not working. Forget it for a while. Stick it in the drawer. Let's work on some other stuff. Forget that project. We'll come back to it. And that's the nice thing about doing a chair, which actually, in a lot of ways, is much better, because as soon as you see it one-to-one and sit on it one-to-one, you find all kinds of mistakes. That it looked great on that computer screen, but actually this is not strong enough, this back angle is not quite right. And so I can sit there with the prototyping team, and we can bang out another prototype even the same day sometimes. I mean, I'd say we get it to, because I've been doing it for a really long time, we get it pretty good in the first crack. I mean, it's probably 70%, 80%. They'll make a second prototype, and if that one's not right, then there's a third one, and that's it. But I don't do any models anymore. It doesn't make any sense. It's much better to have these guys working right there on the real thing, in the real materials. Sometimes we have to use foam instead of, the shaped wood, maybe, because to avoid investing in a mold that might not be quite right. But for the most part, it works really well, because they're right there, and they're great people and really collaborative and happy to develop stuff together. As my name becomes more recognized, which is happening a bit by bit, that helps a lot, because in reality the quality of the counterfeits really sucks. I mean, it's noticeably poor. The distance in cost between the crappy counterfeits and the real thing has shrunk a lot, because we've worked really, really hard to do that. And I think as more people understand where the stuff comes from, who designed it, that means they know where to find it. If they don't know where to find it and they see a counterfeit, then maybe they think that's the original, right? So on three fronts, we're combating that. I'd love to add a fourth, which means somebody with really deep pockets and a machine gun. But I don't have the time or the money or the energy to fight every battle. Everything is registered. It belongs to me theoretically, but there are still some companies that are knocking it off. Try to stay ahead of them. Try and do things that look easy but aren't. I mean, my process is for a chair, for example. I'll try and describe it really quickly. But basically, I have ideas that I start to sketch. And I'm just good enough at sketching that I can communicate what I'm trying to say to much younger, much more talented designers on my team that work really well in 3D. Mostly with Rhino is the program we use. So these kids take my initial concepts and sketches, and we work together to start to model that into something that basically works. Okay, so in terms of the ergonomics, that part's pretty easy because I've got so many chairs that I've already done that I know that this seat angle with that back angle, I know that this curve with that curve, more or less, we know that it's going to work in an ergonomic sense. So that part remains kind of locked down, and the rest becomes like, how do you work with the structure and with the aesthetics, and also about like, where do I want this to fit into the great scheme of things? You know, because a lot of design, especially furniture design, I think it's easy to get caught up in the design of that without thinking about how that fits with somebody's the rest of their living room, for example. You know, okay, that chair's super cool, but what does it go with? You know, it doesn't go with anything. You know, or that dining table's great, but the legs are, you can't fit a chair underneath because the legs look cool, but there's no space for the chair or whatever, you know. So basically, based on that, we start to develop where I want the thing to go. We do one variation that sucks, and I copy it, and I paste it, and I do what our next step is, and that sucks in a different way, and I copy it, and I paste it. And so we have these Rhino files that would be as long as this room with bad ideas that we slowly develop until sometimes we look at it and we go, this completely sucks, and we throw it away. Or we set it aside and go work on something else. Or when I get lucky, what happens is that by the time we've worked through 300 really bad ideas that are completely stupid in different ways, we realize that stupid idea 300 with stupid idea 10, if we put those together, that actually might work. What I tell my team and what I tell students when I work with them is that the most important thing that I've learned as a designer of objects is keep everything in your process. Keep it, every single one, because as stupid as it is, it's going to give you an idea down the line that actually helps put all the pieces together. It's happened to me so many times where you end up with these really dumb ideas, but when this dumb idea and that dumb idea come together, it actually starts to work. For me, design is a very long process of failure. It's a very long process of doing really stupid stuff. I mean, stuff that I look at and go, that's ugly as hell. How can I like move it to the next step? It's all about, it's not like there's this vision that it like drops onto your plate. I mean, it's a bunch of failures. Actually, yes, yeah, for sure, and it drives me, it breaks my heart. I mean, yeah, I'm super sympathetic to other architects that don't have access to the furniture opportunities that I have. I mean, and I'd like to think that that's one of the reasons why some of these pieces are kind of successful, because they work pretty well in other people's projects, and that is a conscious thing that I think about. Like, I mean, not always, but often I'm thinking, okay, you know, how can I make this thing work for somebody else? Because you don't want to like design a really cool restaurant and then put a bunch of Philippe Starck chairs in it, because then you're advertising him, not you, right? So the battle for me is on a personal level. If I have to use another design, it's how do I find something that's neutral, that fits in with, that like on the old kids' report cards in America, it would say plays well with others, works well with others, right? So a lot of what I'm about is, you know, how do I do stuff that works well with others? I'm a bottom feeder. I'm waiting for somebody to throw me some scraps.